and I'm acting chair of the religion department here at PLU. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the fall 2011 religion department lecture. The subject of the evening has to do with ideology and social change. A little vocabulary lesson. Ideologies are networks of ideas or beliefs we hold, often unconsciously, which guide our interpretation and our experience of the world around us. Our ideologies shape our conscious understanding of human actions, the nature of reality, appropriate goals for life, religion, meaning, politics, society, culture, etc. They guide our interpretations of religions, our own and others, and how religion itself is even defined. Let me offer a few examples. One of the not debated assumptions in most political election years is that progress is an unmitigated good. Another ideology that shapes us is the idea that individual happiness is a right to which we are entitled. In these examples, progress and happiness are concepts deeply rooted in ideological structures that shape us. That progress is good and that happiness is deserved are not factual truths. Ideologies provide these interpretive frameworks from which we act for good and for ill. Violence done in the name of religion is quite evident and appalling in world history. However, ideologies more than religion were arguably at the root of the genocides of the last century, in which 50 million people were systematically murdered. In Armenia, Germany, the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, Iraq, Rwanda, and Sudan. So one reason that religion is a required subject here at PLU is because the university has repeatedly affirmed that the world's common good is served by people who can critically engage and analyze ideologies and religious belief systems. And to that end, I'm happy to introduce this evening's lecturer. Since fall 2010, Dr. Erik Hammerstrom has been a member of the religion department here at PLU in comparative religious studies and East Asian religions. He was raised in the rain just outside of Portland, and we are happy that he has come home from his education away. He received a BA from Sarah Lawrence College in New York and a master's in Asian religion from the University of Hawaii. In 2010, he was awarded the PhD with honors in religious studies from Indiana University, Bloomington. His dissertation focused on Buddhism and science in modern China, for which he recently received the Stanley Weinstein Dissertation Prize awarded by the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale University. When he is not working, he reports that he likes to play semi-esoteric stringed instruments, and he supports the Portland Timbers. This evening, the religion department is pleased to present a promising scholar, a snappy dresser, and our colleague for his lecture entitled How China Got Religion, Ideology and Social Change in the Early 20th Century China.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Trelstad, for that great introduction and for a really good explanation of ideology and how it fits into the study of religion. Today, I'm going to talk about how China got religion. And for those of you who are in my Religions of East Asia class, you are probably wondering what I'm talking about. Because China had religion, right? This particular topic is very important. If you open the newspaper or open your browser and direct it to a media outlet and look at articles on China written today, you'll see that the two most common topics, the two most common themes that authors talk about are China's economic growth, its booming economic power, and China's spotty relations with human rights. And the examples that are often given of the latter are persecution of Tibetan monks, Tibetan Buddhists, the arrest of Chinese Christians, particularly in Beijing in recent years, and also the persecution of Muslims, ethnic Muslims in China. So it seems to be that for Westerners who are reading about China, religion is one of those things that is always on their mind. It's always a question. What is happening in China with religion? In the talk today, I'm going to talk about how the modern concept of religion came to China. Not how religious practices came to China or how religious beliefs came to China, but how something called religion became a category in China, and how it became subject to ideology, how it was located within the ideology of just about everybody. I'll show that the move toward dealing with something called religion in restrictive ways and in regulatory ways in China today has as much to do with changes in how China defined religion as with Communist Party positions or Marxist atheism. Now, to get into this topic, I have three statements that we're going to consider. We'll look at each one in turn in a little detail. The first, in the 17th century, there were only 4 religions in the world: Christianity, Judaism, Mohammedanism, and idolatry. Second, before the 20th century, there was no religion in China. And third, today, in the 21st century, there are 5 religions in China. Exactly. Now, each of these statements is false. That should be the first reaction you have to them. But each of these statements is also true in a way. And so I'll talk about each of them in turn to explain how the way that they're true says a lot about how things have changed and where religion is today. So the question I'll try to be answering today is, how did China get religion? And like many scholars in the last 20 years, I'm forced to put my main term in quotes. Religion. Just imagine you're seeing my hands go up every time you see that come up, because that's what I'm talking about today. Today in China, if you have to talk about religion, there's a perfectly good Chinese word, 宗教. And the way people understand this word in China today is very similar to the way that it's understood in the West. It's a pretty even translation with not a lot of difference between the terms. So if you're talking to someone and they say 宗教, you can know they're probably thinking a lot of the same things about religion that you are, generally speaking. How did this come to be? How did this happen that we all started to think about religion in the same way? Let's look at the first statement. First, let me provide the caveat that the term Mohammedanism is slightly offensive, or at the very least inaccurate, when describing Islam, because Muslims don't think that they don't worship Muhammad, right? And it's kind of implied in this. But leaving that aside, and leaving aside that the word idolatry is offensive to just about everyone else who falls into that category, what do you notice about this statement? Is it true that in the 17th century there were only 4 religions in the world? Is it false? Right? I mean, I think I'm seeing a lot of head shaking out there. Right? This is not an accurate statement. But in a way it is true. Right? I'm not saying that there were not Buddhist monks and Hindu housewives and Jain merchants and Sikh farmers in the 17th century. There were. But the way that people who used the word religion, which would be Europeans, the way they understood religion is fairly accurately reflected here. And let's go back just a little bit. Let's go back and look at the word religion. It's a word that I have my students define, or try to define on the first day of class, which, as a good number of you are my students in here, you've recently gone through that exercise. But if we go back and look at the history of the word religion, the Latin word religio, religionis, generally referred to the correct performance of ritual obligations. Religion was the performance of ritual obligations. It didn't refer to faith. It wasn't about belief in a higher power, although that was kind of assumed. And it didn't talk about what happens after death. It was about ritual. Over time, as Christianity came to dominate Europe, this word began to be applied to the rights of non-Christians, and eventually Muslims and Jews were included in the category of peoples of the book, and their practices were understood by this term. By the end of the 17th century, two big shifts had happened in the many others, but the two major shifts had happened in the term religion. One, under the influence of certain Protestant groups who were very anti-ritual, the meaning of religion started to shift to cover personal piety, your personal belief. Religion is about your belief. And the other thing to think about is in the 17th century, European colonization had brought European culture into contact with many cultures in the world. And just to cite one statistic that students in one of my classes will have seen before, between 1815 and 1915, European direct control over the Earth's habitable surface went from 35% to an astounding 85%. By 1915, Europeans had direct colonial control over 85% of the Earth's habitable surface. And that was a lot of people to manage. Part of the successful management of these colonies was knowledge about the people who you're colonizing, knowledge about the people you're trying to control. And so Europe and European intellectuals came into contact with a lot of different religious traditions. And this information came back to Europe, and people started to realize there are actually different kinds of idolatry. And maybe even we shouldn't call them idolatry. Right? Maybe we should come up with some other way to understand all of these things that people in the world are doing. And so it was that in the middle of the 19th century, as colonization is happening, the idea of world religions is created. Europeans were learning a lot about things from all corners of the globe, and under the influence of the Enlightenment, they believed that all of these different things were reflections of some fundamental universal human experience, some kind of category, which they called religion. This was a catch-all category created by people, scholars, explorers, and even religious people themselves, in order to study the great mass of practices and beliefs and texts and customs and all of these things coming in. And scholars tried to figure out what were the common characteristics of all of the creatures that inhabited this imagined category. We have this imagined category of religion and all of these things we're learning about inside of it. What do they all have in common? And this led to a number of different definitions of the word religion. As people started to learn about other religions, believing in Abraham wasn't enough. Then it moved to belief in God. That was a common definition of religion. And then that didn't work because Buddhists, well, they kind of believe in gods, but they're kind of atheistic and they're kind of non-theistic. So belief in a higher power, maybe that's a definition that we can use. In the midst of all this, a number of common ideas developed about things that you will find in religion. And I'll get back to those in a moment. I'll get back to the idea of religion that developed by the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century in the West. But first, as we followed the trajectory in Europe, let's step over to China and see what's happening there until 1900. Before the 20th century, there was no religion in China, or at least no word for it, right? So now I add a little bit of deception, right? At the very first, to kind of pull you in, there's no religion in China. Well, now you can kind of see where I'm going with this. There's no word for religion in China. Again, this statement is both true and misleading. It's true that the modern word for religion in China is basically the same thing that we mean it to be in the West. But this word did not enter the Chinese lexicon until about 1900. The word 宗教 enters the lexicon in 1900 or 1901. But, this is big but, it didn't mean that people in China weren't doing things we would call religious. What it means is that people in China thought about those activities in different ways. They were embedded in different ideological structures. And this influenced the way that people behaved, as Professor Trelstad said in her very good introduction. Ideologies affect the way people behave. It affects the way governments relate to things. It affected the way that governments related to religion in China before the 20th century and since. Robert Campany, in his excellent study of the metaphors used in medieval Chinese to discuss religion, points out that the things that we refer to as religion in China today were understood in different ways in China. First, one way that people thought about religions was as ways or paths. Right? This is the translation of the pretty well-known Chinese word dao, a way or a path. Most people in the West are at least passingly familiar with this term. And so in China, religions were described as ways or paths. Buddha taught a way, or possibly multiple ways. Confucius taught a way. So you can talk about the Tao of Buddha and the Tao of Confucius. Long before there was a Tao of Hu, there was a Tao of all of these people. Another way of thinking about religion, the way that you find people talking about religion before the modern period in China, was as collections of methods. These were believed to be practiced for attaining certain goals, such as nirvana in Buddhism, or physical immortality in religious Taoism. Because they were methods, or collections of methods, religions in China were not approached as all-encompassing systems. They weren't exclusive. It was common to see the average person going to every temple in a village if they needed something, regardless of whether it was Taoist or Buddhist or whoever was in the temple. Now, this lack of specificity, right, this kind of way of going to all the different religious professionals in the neighborhood, we shouldn't view this against the definition that we might bring, that some of us might bring from the West, where that just seems like kind of a wishy-washy approach to religion, and why don't you commit, and what's wrong, what, you know. That's not how people thought about it in China. This is what religion was legitimately for. It was to offer ways and methods for accomplishing certain goals and for attaining what you needed most in life. In his article, Robert Campany notes that one thing that is strikingly absent from discussions of religion before the modern period is any discussion of religion and faith. This is an important point to note in our culture, where the word faith has become synonymous with religion. You can ask someone, what is your faith? Or you can talk about people of faith. Or there is the, and I have to check this to get it right because the name changed a couple times. In the United States, the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and formerly Faith-Based Initiatives, I believe. And those faith-based initiatives are things that are put forth by religious groups. This is important to note because even in China today, you can talk about religion as faith. It's synonymous. 信仰 can be used to describe faith or religion. Before the 20th century, though, this was not the case. Chinese religion was not marked by collections of doctrinal assumptions, the way that different denominations of Christianity are marked by their different creeds. Religion in China was not about one's assent to beliefs or a proposition. Is Jesus the Son of God? I believe Jesus is the Son of God. Therefore, you can be a Christian, right? Again, I'm simplifying, but to draw a comparison. This is not the way that people approach religion in China. Because of this, religions were not treated as total systems. You didn't have to just belong to one. And even the idea of belonging to specific religions, most people wouldn't have made sense to a lot of people. Beyond the characteristics, let me say a few short words about how religion functioned. Right? So this is how people talk about religion. But how did religion work in China before the modern period? I'll talk briefly about state religion, and then I'll talk about communal religion. State religion refers to a network of gods, a kind of government of gods, that exists on the earth and exists on the earth and in the heavens, and parallels the earthly government. So the example I often use with students in my classes, okay, so we would have a mayor of Tacoma, and then we have the city god of Tacoma. And they're the same rank, and they both have jobs of keeping an eye on things and keeping everything running smoothly. The earthly emperor sits at the apex of the earthly government, and the earthly emperor also outranks all of the other gods. So if the city god of Tacoma is not protecting us from floods or pestilence, they can be fired and then replaced with another god, because they're part of the government. So the government and religion were intimately connected in this way. The emperor, because of his role at the apex of earthly authority, was also in charge of keeping an eye on all the other gods, all the other people who occupied the temples in our neighborhoods. And the emperor's job was to distinguish between the good practices that were helpful for the people and bad practices that were harmful and wasteful and extravagant. Under this arrangement, when the government intervened and interfered in religious activity, which it did a lot in pre-modern China, it was to arbitrate which gods were licit and which were illicit, which were legal and which were illegal. And this authority extended into the level of the communal religion. Now, communal religion was the most common form of religious activity in China. Communal religion refers to all of the activities related to the spiritual world that happen in neighborhoods and communities. A lot of these we could call festivals, as they usually occurred on holidays or when the town was doing something, building a big new building or a new temple. I won't get too much into the details, but there's a few key elements to pay attention to when we're thinking about communal religious life. First, this was the main venue through which people engaged in religious activity. The main venue was through communal religious activity. Such activities were woven into the communal life of the locale. For example, when it was time to build a new temple, they would go around and they would collect money from every household. It was never asked, do you believe in the God who's going to be in the temple? Irrelevant. If you said no, it wouldn't matter. You still have to pay the money and help build the temple for the good of the community. Communal religious life happened when it was necessary. It was done with the whole community. It was not something you worked at every day or even every week. So the idea of going to temple every Sunday was not part of the communal religious life in China. Communal religious activity was overseen by part-time religious professionals, people who would be hired for the occasion, but who otherwise had day jobs. Maybe they're a farmer or a doctor, and you'd hire them to come in and do some rituals during the festival. But it wasn't something people did all the time. Now, there were Buddhists and Taoists who lived religious lives usually kind of apart from the community. And the communities would often hire them to come in. They would hire the Buddhist monks to come in, the Taoist priests to come in and do some rituals, but that wasn't the center of the festival. That kind of happened in a part of the temple, but meanwhile there's a puppet show going on outside, and there are kung fu demonstrations, and there are fireworks, and there's some other things happening. These festivals contained a lot of different activities then. And they were centered on the gods. And the rules for how to run the festival didn't come from some central scripture. There was no central text of communal Chinese religion. There was no Bible. Different communities had different texts for how to do little pieces of ritual, but there was no central text explaining, this is what we people in China believe, this is what we do, this is why we do it. The way that you find in some other traditions. So, I've chosen these particular features on purpose, and hopefully you're starting to see a little bit about how what counted as communal religion in China looks different than what you may think of as religion. And I'll highlight some of the differences later in the talk. But let me first summarize these basic features. For most people, for the vast majority of people in China, their religious activity can be characterized as follows. They understood religion, or we could say religions, or religion, it's hard to say, as outlining ways or methods to reach certain goals. These were not exclusive or all-encompassing systems of belief or behavior. Second, religious activity was integrated in communal life at a very basic level. So in other words, to live in a certain neighborhood meant to do that religious stuff that the people in that neighborhood did, the way they did it. Third, aside from the government, there were no large-scale institutions. There was no singular Buddhist church that all Buddhists in China had to answer to. There weren't even multiple Buddhist kind of large-scale organizations, the way that Lutherans, for instance, in America, are divided into several major denominations. Fourth, much of religious life in China was occasional. It was not expected to be something that you did every day. And it didn't say much about like how to live your life in ethical ways. Communities could organize large temple celebrations, but going to temple was otherwise a personal activity that you did when you needed to, when you needed something, when you had a problem. Fifth, although there were Buddhist monks and Taoist priests, the majority of people who performed religious rituals were not trained professionals, nor did their authority come about because they were recognized by some institution. And finally, much of Chinese religious life was not governed by fixed canons or authoritative scriptures. So this is how people in China, for the most part, understood religion before the 20th century. Or this is how it appeared in practice. This is, in a very rough sketch, what most religious life looked like before the 20th century. Now we move to statement 3. There are 5 religions in China today. Here's one report. The constitutions and laws protect normal religious activities, which are overseen by the 5, here they are, Buddhist, Taoist, Muslim, Catholic, and Protestant, state-sanctioned patriotic religious associations. By law, only they may register religious groups and places of worship. And by law, you have to practice religion in a registered location.
So what I'm focusing on here is 5 religions. Right? There are 5. So for those of you who have your midterm tomorrow in my class, if I ask you that question, you know what the answer is now. Very easy, right? There are 5. So how did China go from what we just saw to 5 religions 111 years later? To understand how this happened, it is important to have a little background, a little historical background. And I'll try to keep this short. I'm a historian both by inclination and by training, so sometimes it's hard for me to keep the facts, keep them kind of limited. Until the 16th century, until the 16th century, China was probably the most advanced nation on the planet, both scientifically and technologically, until the 16th century. It was a strong nation, and it held all of the surrounding nations in some kind of vassalage. Now, certainly, China had its ups and downs, the Mongol invasion, the Manchus conquering. There are ups and downs in China's history. But many Chinese thinkers rightly saw themselves as the center of the civilized world. Now, fast forward to the 19th century, 3 centuries later. By the end of the 19th century in 1900, Chinese forces had lost a number of major battles, fought over their own territory. It had been lost not only to European powers, but also to a tiny, insignificant island nation called Japan, which Chinese thinkers had known was inferior to China for a long time. And they lost a naval battle with them. Not exactly analogous, but it would be like if we lost a naval battle to Cuba. It would be a little shocking. It was very shocking in China. And the losses to the European powers were very shocking. And rather than stick their heads in the sand, a lot of people in China said, all right, we need to deal with this. We've got some serious issues here. We've given up all these cities along the coast that now these Europeans run as their own territory. They're now allowing we now have to allow all these Protestant missionaries to come in. That's not what we as a nation, as an empire want. Maybe the Westerners have something we can learn. And so Chinese thinkers engaged in a very careful and measured study of Western learning, as it was called, xixue, to see if there was anything that could be learned from the West. They started with science and technology in the mid to late 19th century, and they moved to philosophy and political science. And all of this study of foreign terms, foreign ideas, brought in the need for new Chinese terms to translate some of them. One of these new words was 宗教, religion. It was actually created, the word was created in Japan to translate Western words into Japanese, and then it was imported back into China. But it wasn't imported by itself, right? You can't just create a new word and then bring it in and everyone knows what it means. Apple floss. Apple floss. No idea what I mean. Right? You have to embed that word in some explanation. You have to explain what apple floss is. And if any of you have an idea, you can let me know after this talk. And the same thing happened in China. They had to explain what is religion. And they imported lots of arguments. Through careful study, they learned about arguments that were happening in the West about what religion is and what its proper role in society is. And pretty soon, it was pitted against science. So, as Professor Trellstadt said, this is what I have studied. I've studied it because it's important. I'm not talking about it because I've studied it. It's the relation between science and religion in China is a very important one. Let me give you some background. As I mentioned, starting in 1841, with the loss of China to England during the Opium Wars, China was forced to open its doors and its countryside to primarily evangelical Protestant missionaries. And they came into China, and part of their larger argument in general was, we are coming here with superior civilization. We have our civilization because we're Christian, and the proof is our advanced science and technology. And so they created an early argument in the 19th century that Western culture, military power, and Christian religion were intimately connected. And Chinese thinkers who were trying to fend off the claims of Western superiority were studied. And they discovered that even within the Western tradition, there were arguments about Christianity. There were actually people in the West who were arguing about Christianity. Of course, there were arguments about Darwin. What did Darwin mean? What is Darwin's discoveries? What was his theories? What did they mean for biblical authority, and what did they mean for religion? Darwinism had already become popular in China as an explanation of why there was struggle between groups and nations, something that China had first-hand experience with. Darwinian evolution was used in China to argue against educated Christian missionaries and their claims about the truth of the Bible. So, Protestant missionaries primarily came in and they brought technical know-how in science and religion, and they said, you should become Christian because makes a lot of sense, and here's the book, and it says where everything comes from. And Chinese thinkers said, you know what? We've heard about Darwin, and we know that he undermines the scripture entirely. Now, the actual arguments that were happening in the West and continue to happen are far more nuanced and complicated. And if you are interested in learning more about that, I recommend taking a class with Professor Trollstadt. She teaches an excellent class on that. But in China, this was kind of boiled down into these little arguments of science versus religion. And a third term was added to these discussions in the early 20th century. So you had science, you had religion, and they added a third term, which was superstition, 迷信. And within the first decades of the 20th century, they started to kind of separate religion and superstition from each other. And the stuff that was bad, that's superstition. And that's anti-science. If it's anti-science, it's superstition, that's bad. We don't need it as a country. We need to get rid of it. Religion, maybe that's okay. There were a lot of arguments within China about this thing called religion. And those arguments led to changes in how that term was defined. Right? For people who didn't like anything about traditional China, and there were some of these people, they said, it's all superstition. And the stuff that's not superstition is, you could call it religion, but it's still bad. And then you had people who were more modern, probably a lot more of them. And they said, okay, there's science, which is good. We agree. Science is good. Everyone agrees. Okay. But there are some things that we will call religion, which are also good. They're good for people, they're good for society, and modern advanced nations have religion, and we need to allow those things. We don't have to allow superstition. So you can tell if you are a religious person and you're practicing some kind of religious practice, it's really important that you get your thing labeled religion and not superstition. Because if it's superstition, you've got everybody turning against you. Until about the 1920s, Chinese thinkers generally agreed with their Christian counterparts in defining the word religion as monotheistic faith. So until the 1920s in China, religion basically meant belief in one single God. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam, those are religions. Everything else that happens in China, we're still not sure about that, but it's not religion. In the 1920s, the 1930s, a lot of people who practiced those other things, Buddhists, of which there were a lot of them, Taoists, and other people argued to have their groups included in this special protected category of religion. And by 1931, Buddhism was officially recognized as a religion. So that sounds good, right? I mean, it sounds like the definition of religion in China is expanding, and it's including more of what was actually happening on the ground. That's what it looks like, but that's not actually what was happening. The category was getting smaller. What was allowed in religion stayed pretty small, and a few things were added. But a lot of religious life, what we would call religious life in China, was excluded from that category. From the 1920s to the present, the general understanding of the word religion that one finds in China is very similar to ones that you might find in the West. The definition that is kind of worked out in the 20s has these qualities. Religions, under the influence of discourses coming from the West about what religion is, from Protestant missionaries, from Western thinkers, both pro and against religion, have similar definitions. Religions are exclusive systems of belief with exclusive systems of practice with an emphasis on personal belief. Religion is comprised of activities separate from your ordinary life, but including personal ethical guidelines. So, the person who is your neighbor, they don't go to the same church you do. Neither does the person you work next to. Neither does the person you sit next to at school. Religion is something you do separately from those areas. Religion is organized into regional and national institutions. Religions have permanent structures, temples, churches, altars. And religions rely on trained professional clergy. Finally, religions are centered on authoritative canons, the Bible, the Quran, specific Buddhist scriptures. Now, this is a general definition of religion that was accepted. It's important, it continues to be important for religious practitioners in China to have their tradition labeled as religion, because religion is protected in the Chinese Constitution. What follows is this is an English translation of Article 36 of the Chinese Constitution, taken from the Chinese government English language page, so this is not my translation. Citizens of the People's Republic of China enjoy freedom of religious belief. If you take nothing away from this talk, this little snippet of the contemporary constitution of the PRC is an interesting point. No state organ, public organization, or individual may compel citizens to believe in or not believe in any religion, nor may they discriminate against citizens who believe in or do not believe in any religion. The state protects normal religious activities. No one may make use of religion to engage in activities that disrupt public order, impair the health of citizens, or interfere with the educational system of the state. So you can't go to church until you're 18, because you're still under education, at least not legally. Finally, religious bodies and religious affairs are not subject to any foreign domination. I will just point out a couple things here. The first line, belief. Religion is about belief. This is a shift. Second, the state protects normal religious activities. 正常的宗教活动, for the Chinese speakers. It's vague in Chinese too. What is a normal religious activity? They kind of define it here, right? But it does give latitude. This is how constitutions in general are. Our constitution is in some ways vague as well. So this is not unique. So what is meant here by religion? What kind of activity is protected as normal religious activity? And what is not included? What is deemed superstitious, or to use the communist terminology, feudalistic? In general, the definition of religion that operates in China today is basically the same as the one worked out in the early 20th century by Chinese intellectuals who fit many different labels. They were conservative, they were liberal, they were anarchists, they were socialists. They were Buddhists, they were Christians. Together they worked out a kind of definition of religion, as we've seen. So let's compare where we've come. What did religion look like in China before the 20th century? Non-exclusive collections of ways and methods, integrated into communal life, no large-scale institutions, occasionally, mostly lacking trained professionals, mostly, again, there are Buddhist monks, not dependent on a central authoritative canon. Religion, as it is generally understood today, they are exclusive systems of practice with an emphasis on personal belief, as in the Constitution. Activities separate from ordinary life, but including personal ethics. Organized into regional and national institutions. There are the 5 institutions that run religion in China. They oversee it. They register people. They register locations. Religions have permanent structures. Religions rely on trained professional clergy who are trained generally at the seminaries run by the 5 large organizations. And religions have central authoritative canons. So you see the disconnect. The way that religion is treated today, the way it is understood in China, and the way it's understood by a lot of people, not everyone in the West, is at odds with the way that religious life actually worked in China before the 20th century. Now, just to clarify, I've really oversimplified these definitions and possibly made some of my colleagues cringe a little bit, or maybe just think, I don't know about that. I've been oversimplifying to prove a point, that there has been a big shift between what religion looked like in China and what it is now defined as. By way of conclusion, let me just say a few things that have changed. Buddhism, instead of being scattered temples throughout the country, is now unified by a single organization. If you want to become a monk or a nun, you have to pass an entrance exam and get your license to monk. That's what I call it. You get an official license. No such thing existed before the 20th century. If you're a lay person, more lay people are self-consciously identifying as with just one religious tradition. It's becoming more clear what that membership entails. Certain activities, regular temple attendance, the study of particular scriptures. Buddhism has fared fairly well under this system because Buddhism has been able to fashion itself in a way that meets the modern definition. Not as successful has been the majority of religious life, the folk religious life, popular religious life, communal religious life. The occasional activities that villages did around temples with semi-trained professionals are still technically illegal. They happen. Religion has come back in a huge way. If you go to China, if you've been to China, you'll see temples are being rebuilt. People are going to temple. People are burning incense. People are praying. It's happening. But a lot of it happens in spite of the fact that some of it is deemed illegal. Some folk religious temples register with the Buddhist Association or they register with the Taoist Association, even though they don't have any Buddhist images inside of them or monks living there. But that's a way to become legal. You have to register with one of the major organizations. Other practices that are superstitious, fortune-telling, exorcism, spirit mediums, all kinds of some kinds of traditional spirit-based medicine. These things are all technically illegal. They happen, but they fall outside of what is generally understood as religion and what is protected as normal religious activity. Now, it's hard to say where religion in China is going to go in the next 30 years. In the last 30 years, there's just been an amazing explosion. It's a good time to study Chinese religion. 30 years ago was a very depressing time to study Chinese religion. And even more depressing to be a religious person in China. It's a much better time for that now. But where religion goes in China, it's hard to say, but certainly it will follow probably some of the lines that I've laid out here since China got religion. Thank you very much. So I have time for a few questions. Anyone has any questions about this? No questions about the testimony, please. Yeah, Gloria.
Kind of about this,
I'm sorry, let me get a little closer.
This is kind of about this, okay, I noticed on your slide.
No, you don't.
Okay. On your slide that says it's after the 1920s, like things that became part of the religious transition. Correct me if I was wrong, but I saw the permanent structures on there, on that slide, after the 1920s. Okay, wasn't it during the 1960s that they destroyed a whole bunch of temples and like flushed out a lot of like Buddhists and Taoists in your class? We were talking about this, that there was a lot of destruction. That's why there's a rebuild now going on. If it was a part of that definition of religion after the 1920s, why did they go, okay, well, we hate your buildings, we're going to tear them down?
Okay, so that's so the question, if you didn't hear that, is why, if permanent structures was part of the definition of religion, why was it that the Cultural Revolution tore down religious institutions? That's a separate thing. So what I was talking about was pretty much the definition of what religion was. As the communists took power after the Great Leap Forward, and particularly under the Cultural Revolution, the communists who were atheists basically said, we don't care what you call it, we don't like it. It's not part of the communist program. Religion is not something helpful. It's actually harmful for society, so we need to get rid of it. So they kind of followed the same definitions of religion, and so they went after the things that were most obvious in that definition. So it's not the definition that changed. The definition was the same. The government policy did a 180.
So it's like communism tore down buildings.
Yeah, over-enthusiastic youths.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think China has accepted a westernized view of religion over the past 100 years or so since, in order to, for economic benefit? I mean, we see Western religions coming in, Protestant religions, such have profited, when they profited from religion. China opens their mind up a little bit to that because they look at the economy. Do you think that would be a reason why?
I think the first thing I would say is it wasn't, and if I'm given this impression, I need to correct that. It wasn't that Chinese thinkers simply just took the Western idea and just said, great, we'll take that. There was a lot of discussion about how this kind of fit with the Chinese situation. And the people who were doing this and who kind of came up with this spanned the entire political and religious spectrum. It was a large-scale discussion. It was a large discussion, what one scholar called the 1920s was a period of compressed modernity. So a lot of stages that the West went through in talking about religion, talking about science, dealing with traditional culture and traditional social organization, traditional politics, yada, yada. All of those things were dealt with in a longer time period than in China. In China, it was dealt with very quickly. Religion was just one part of everything that was going on. And so I would say I don't think it was a cynical move, right? It didn't give the Protestants any more power. In fact, after the 20s, Protestant missionaries were basically asked to leave. And Protestantism kind of continued, but it wasn't for the benefit of Protestants. And I don't think that economics, I think partly the issue of power was a lot to do with it. There was this whole movement called the self-strengthening movement that started in the 1890s. And it was, how can we make China so strong that we don't have to deal with foreign invaders anymore, knocking on our door and telling us to open up and trade with them even though we don't want to. Right? So there was a larger need for strength. But this wasn't like, they didn't say, okay, what do we need to be strong? We need religion. It was a much larger, more complex process.
So they didn't use like a Western view of religion as a tool for economic growth to fight against Western.
No, no, and I would say it's not even a Western concept of religion. I'd say it's a modern definition of religion. Yeah, because I mean we're all becoming modern at this time. West and East in the 20s, and we're all kind of becoming modern. So. Yeah.
Yes. My father was a missionary in China. I was born in China.
My goodness.
A family, number of them were China missionaries. So very, very interesting. You mentioned the 20s. This was a real struggle for missionaries because of small communist uprisings.
Yeah.
And it was a struggle even in the 30s. And after the Japanese invaded, and then as far as mission activity, it was on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
But now I hear that there's a great growth in Christian missions and Christians.
There has been a great growth in Christianity in China, and it's happening all across the social spectrum. You have farmers out in the rural villages who are whole villages are turning to Christianity. I mean, it's not just like one every week, but I mean it's kind of a whole village will embrace Christianity. And you also see educated college students who go to Beijing University, which is the Harvard of China.
But it was a struggle. It was really a struggle.
Yeah,
In the 30s.
interesting. Yeah, I mean it's between as the number I give to the students in my classes, they estimate now between 10 and 100 million Protestants in China, with another 12 or so million Catholics. So it's still not legal for foreigners to proselytize in China in any way. And it's actually technically not legal for Chinese citizens to proselytize. You can have a church, you can sell Bibles at a church, but you can't go out and sing. But as some of my students have seen in class, that doesn't prevent young people from going out and singing Christian hymns in the countryside. Thank you. Other questions? Oh. Yeah. Let me walk a little closer. So you mean the list I give on the left, that list? So the question is, did the traditional understanding of religion, was that shaped by the culture? I would say, yeah. I mean, what I've laid out here is not a definition that if you were to go 150 years back in time and say, what's religion? The first question someone would ask you is, what does that mean? We don't have that word. So I've kind of created this, and I've done it to reflect what, as historians, what we know was happening in China. So that this is as best I can do to give a very short description of how religious life worked in China in a short time. Michael?
There's another question. It is interesting you say that we now have 5 religions in China, or something like that. And at least I'm an old person, and I recall in my class on the religions of East Asia, there was a homegrown Chinese guy named Confucius that we talked about. So,
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention him.
yeah, no, I know he seems famous by his absence. When
Yes.
I talk about Confucianism, and its role, if it isn't religious, what is it?
It's officially not religion.
Okay.
It's a philosophy. It's a humanistic philosophy. And this is a debate that people who study Confucianism have. His concept of heaven, is that a divine notion? I've had discussions about this with students who are fairly well informed, gone back and forth. I think it's kind of religious. There are a lot of rituals. There is a kind of larger worldview that goes beyond the material, which is kind of pointing to some larger reality of causality and so forth. So it kind of seems to be heading in that direction for me personally, as a scholar. But the official line is that it's a humanistic philosophy, or it's part of Chinese culture, which is why you have these Confucius institutes, like the Goethe institutes, which are kind of all over the place nowadays as a way of kind of a projection of Chinese soft power. Is the way to put it.
So, but you don't have to register, and it's not illegal.
Confucianism?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No, you don't. And it's not something. It's Confucius. There's less to do
There's a more complicated answer to that. Paul?
I think Michael and I may have a similar train of thought, but at any rate, I'm second the notion that there's a lot of religious phenomena developing more recently. You see it everywhere. But I'm thinking of a lot of people that I would talk with, perhaps, if I were coming out with the word Zongjiao, they would negate it immediately, say that's not what I'm talking about. And so, and they also certainly wouldn't characterize themselves as superstitious. So I'm just saying that as we get into the 21st century, we see more and more what we would call perhaps religious phenomena developing. Is it not possibly time for a new word? Maybe I'd like to suggest Apple Floss.
Billy, I think that's a really good point. I think still, look, my guess is, and I'd have to think more about the specific phenomenon that you're describing, but I think still lurking in the background is, if they're saying it's not religious, I think they're still using this criteria, right? And it's especially important that it's not religion, oddly enough. If it's not superstition, you don't want to call it religion because then it's subject to the regulation of the state. Right? So maybe if you call it something else. I mean, the same thing happened with Qigong in the mid-20th century. The communists loved Qigong, and they put a lot of effort as a way of getting to health, as a kind of a cheap medical practice. And then that led to the rise of these charismatic Qigong masters who had these wild syncretic philosophies, including the guy who founded Falun Gong. And so that comes out of a kind of a non-category. Qigong it's kind of scientific, therefore it's okay, and then over time it kind of takes on these elements that eventually get labeled superstition. And very briefly, just to reply to that superstition, Adam Chow, the anthropologist, he has an excellent book on folk religious temples in northern Shanxi. And he's actually reports that in that area, he asked people their religion, and they say, I believe in, my faith is superstition, I believe in superstition. And no one has consciousness about that. So it does happen, apparently, in some places that people say they believe in superstition. So I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight.